トビデオ
As you know, this is the 3rd anniversary of me making the series KYOTO video. And because this is such a special occasion, it's usually around this time that I devote a video to a very special topic. 2 years ago, I talked about one of my all-time favorite anime. Last year, I talked about an appropriately big anime that effectively pulls off a colossal narrative with all the pomp and breathtaking theatricality it deserves. But this year, instead of pulling favorites or examining large-scale works, I want to take the time to look at one of retro anime's most prominent curiosities. An anime that, considering my line of work, I'm obligated to do a video on. Welcome everyone to the experience known as Cipher the Video. It was released in 1989 and it runs for the typical OVA length of 40 minutes. And this is pretty much it. What you are seeing right now is all there is to see of Cipher the Video. Themes, character development, plot, bah! Cipher the Video rejects such outdated concepts. The whole anime is just this. Extended montages of the characters dancing, interacting with each other silent movie style, or shots of New York City so lovingly rendered that you wonder if a tourism board is funding this. All of which is given the best editing techniques that Video Toaster ever forged, plus a licensed soundtrack that's mostly cribbed from Footloose, with an opening and closing theme courtesy of We Have Phil Collins at Home.
Well, there's just an empty space. There's nothing left here to remind me.
I mean, that's not the entire anime. There are some bits of dialogue sprinkled throughout, dialogue which is spoken entirely in English by native speakers.
It's been a while since you've appeared in a movie, hasn't it?
Yes. I've been doing the TV series.
I said native, not professional. And its 40-minute length is also inaccurate. The anime actually is more or less 23 minutes, with the rest of the OVA being devoted to a behind-the-scenes featurette about how this anime was made.
In this way, music, dialogue, and animation got together. In Cipher, the video was made.
Cipher the Video is really the most baffling, inexplicable product of the OVA era. With how it almost feels specifically made to confound the masses, it has earned the right to be one of those retro anime oddities that every anime content creator and their dog need to do a video on. But considering how this anime causes people to tilt their heads and furrow their brows, Cipher the Video is an anime that cannot be analyzed in a traditional manner. You cannot grade an anime like this on a 1 to 5 scale. This is an anime that needs to be approached more like an ancient riddle. It's less a piece of art and more of a puzzle that needs to be solved. So for this video, we need to figure out what is Cipher the Video, or better yet, why is Cipher the Video? On February of 1985, manga author Minako Narita published the first chapter of what would be her most well-known title, Cipher. It was serialized in the monthly shoujo magazine Lala, which is known nowadays as the home of such famous titles like Kaorei Kano, Ouran High School Host Club, and Natsumi's Book of Friends, among others. But at the time, their popular title throughout most of the 80s was Cipher. It was popular enough that it actually warranted a sequel series called Alexandrite that ran throughout the mid-90s. It was also licensed over here in the States during the mid-2000s manga boom, it being the standout title of DC Comics' CMX imprint when they wanted to get in on all the manga action. But once DC shut down CMX in 2010, Cipher went out of print. Anyways, the plot of Cipher concerns Anise Murphy, an American high schooler who is captivated by her mysterious classmate Siva, a beautiful former child actor turned teenage model who has a reputation for being aloof and eccentric. Anise takes a chance and proclaims to Siva that she wants to be his friend, which he accepts, no strings attached. But shortly afterwards, she discovers that Siva has an identical twin brother named Cipher, and that the two of them like to pretend to be each other and switch places from time to time. Anise wants to know why that is, and the twins make a bet with her. If she can learn the subtle differences between the two of them, Siva and Cipher will tell her why they constantly switch places. Anise accepts, on the condition that she moves in with them for 2 weeks so that she can better observe them in their natural habitat. 80s pretty boys in the mist. In that period, Anise learns a lot about the twins by getting an intimate look into their lives. She learns that Cipher, despite being the older of the two, is super sensitive and acts like the younger of the two. He also has a habit of just wandering the city in a daze when he seems especially troubled. Siva, meanwhile, acts more like the domestic big brother, handling the finances, the cooking, and the cleaning, basically doing all the responsible sibling shit and being the typical brother's keeper. But the twins' most favorite pastime is unbuttoning their dress shirts, reclining on the bedding, and giving each other the most passionate kisses on the lips. It should be noted that the twins explicitly say they are not gay, it's just something twin boys their age like to do. But in spite of Narita's love for the twincest teasing, Cipher really isn't that kind of manga. What initially looks to be a fabulous slice of fujoshi bait based in 80s pop culture is instead a nice, slow-burning romance manga. Emphasis on the slow because this is a manga that really takes its sweet time in having its characters interact with each other in incredibly mundane ways, like Cipher teaching Anise proper flossing techniques. It's most certainly not a manga for the impatient. But its greatest weakness ends up being its greatest strength. The way information is conveyed to the audience makes the characters feel more real, and the dramatic turns carry more weight. Finding out that Siva and Cipher's real names are actually Jake and Roy comes off as a much bigger bombshell because of it. The focus on character interactions also makes the character development come off a lot stronger. We learn that Siva and Cipher's attachment to one another is really of one of codependence, and it gets to the point where they realize that in order for them to have better relationships with people and lead normal lives, they need to learn to not be as dependent on each other. Cipher is unique in how it deals with its story. In a genre that's bursting at the seams with insane melodrama, Cipher feels like a refreshing change of pace with how human it all feels. Even with all the boy baits, it's a thoughtful story about how good relationships can help build better relationships. So why all of this? Shoujo titles don't get anime adaptations as often as shonen or seinen titles do, so when an anime adaptation is in the works, that's a sign that the title is hella popular and great care must be given in choosing a studio to adapt the title to screen. So Cipher the Video went to Magic Bus, who you all know have such a great track record at this point in time.
Hey, do you want to sit on my face?
But to their credit, they did choose Tsuneo Tominaga to direct the anime, whose big break was directing the shoujo sci-fi film They Were 11. He's someone who has experience with the demographic. And after reading the manga and seeing its appeal, I have a better understanding of what Tominaga was going for. The notion of Cipher the Video is trying to tell the manga story via colorful, highly edited music video montages, and all within the span of 20 minutes. A bold director's choice, but one that I can see the thought process behind. You only have so much time and money, why not do something that's economical, yet effortlessly tells the story while keeping the story's overall mood? The famous Let's Hear It for the Boy montage is actually telling the story of the first arc. Anise declares her friendship to Siva, she learns they're twins and their real names, she hangs out with them. Pretty much everything you see here that may appear random, like Anise devouring Siva's lunch or the Halloween parade, are all stuff that happens in the manga. Of course, after that is the few bits of dialogue in the anime with Siva getting an in-character interview. I actually do like how this scene is bordered with segments of Siva shooting the movie and talking with the director, interspersed with his interview before going into a fake trailer. It makes it feel like it's a segment on a news show or in Entertainment Tonight and the like. But the acting. I bet you are all wondering what's the deal with that.
Well, I've been in this world since I was real small, so I think I could understand all the troubles and joys he went through.
It's easy to tell that they got actual native English speakers to do the dialogue for this. They aren't being tripped up by their pronunciations and have clear American accents. So why do they recite all their lines like they are Publix employees over the intercom who have clearly lost their will to live?
He's a cute boy. Of course I know him. I enjoy watching his movies.
Not interested.
I'm crazy about him. Let me get to meet him.
This is probably the result of the directors being non-English speakers. No matter how good a voice actor is, they are going to be lost without someone giving them direction. And when the directions the actors are given have an obvious language barrier in between them, it results in performances that may sound okay to non-English speaking ears, but awkward to those who actually speak the language. It's the reason why so many English localizations for video games in the 90s just sounded like that.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
But the big problem with Cipher the Video is that it doesn't execute the idea of telling a story through music videos all that well. The idea of using a series of music videos to tell a complete story is doable. I went over this in my video on Interstellar 4.5, which tells an excellent story just by using the music from a Daft Punk album. But what made that anime work is the production team knowing exactly how to tell a complete story from beginning, middle, and end through the music. Each music video segment is its own miniature story that encompasses a plot beat and a larger story. Cipher the Video, meanwhile, just feels content to play the story out via montages with zero connectivity to the events happening in the story. You're just getting an incredibly abridged version of the manga. An abridged version that removes a lot of the drama that is the emotional core of the story. The Kamikaze segment near the end is focused on the events that cause Jake and Roy to keep switching places as Siva and Cipher. Ignoring how being a musical montage with no dialogue removes a lot of the specifics for non-manga readers, it also softens the events that are transpiring. In Cipher the Video, it just looks to be that Roy is sick with the flu, and Jake is just wandering around the city looking all pensive, worrying about him. But in the manga, what's actually going on is that Roy is a heroin addict. It's revealed that Jake had Roy take his place as Siva one day when he was too sick to go to a shoot, and he soon learned that it was a great way to get him away from the drugs for a little while. Roy soon decides that he wants to become clean for his brother's sake, but wants to beat it by himself. So, in order to detox, he handcuffs himself to the bathroom sink, gives Jake the key, and tells him to leave the apartment because he doesn't want his brother to see him at his lowest point. Yeah, that whole plotline doesn't come across at all in the anime adaptation. For a manga with its greatest strength being its human drama, the anime sure does a good job in removing all of that. The way Cipher the Video is directed as an adaptation is very suboptimal. People who haven't read the manga are going to be completely flummoxed by what the hell is even going on, and people who have read the manga are going to be let down by how much it removes a lot of the story's strengths. Anise, who's the main protagonist / insert character, doesn't even get a line. Why would they make an anime like this? You could have easily made a 40-minute OVA just about the first arc of Anise staying at the twins' house and the shenanigans that ensue from there. Why structure it like a disconnected series of montages and in-person interviews and just completely remove the emotional core of the story? I think I know why, and if you ask me, it totally works in the anime's favor. We've seen 80s anime like Cipher the Video before on the show, titles whose main goal is to capture a moment in time via its aesthetics and editing techniques. Titles like Toy and 1919, anime that rely heavily on stylish montages and popular music-laden soundtracks so they can successfully capture the moment in time they were made in. But what separates those two anime and Cipher is the location. Toy is an anime that glamorizes the underground Japanese punk subculture of the 80s. 1919 tells a bittersweet romance amongst the Japanese nightlife of the 80s. Cipher the Video takes place in the 80s, but is nowhere near the vicinity of Japan. One of the best things about reading the manga is that Narita is very open about what influences her in creating Cipher, and what she loves is America. She is a self-admitted Americanophile, to the point that even if she does want to over-idealize the setting, she is committed to getting the country right. In the period where she wrote Cipher, she spent a lot of company time and money on research trips, and boy do they end up paying dividends. When she wasn't splurging on all the toys and music that she could only get in America, Narita was painstakingly capturing the Americana of the setting, drawing the New York City skylines at all angles, capturing the city on the ground from its glamorous boulevards to its dingiest alleys. Another reason why Cipher moves at such a leisurely pace is that you get the feeling that Narita wants to take in daily life in America for all it's worth. It's not just a romance manga or character piece, but also a means by which the average Japanese reader can vicariously live the experience of being an average American teenager. I know for a fact that the average American teenager wasn't a hot movie star living in a classy brownstone, but it definitely feels more true to life than other Japanese takes on the states.
Hey, fucking cowboy, fucking cowgirl, how the fuck are you doing?
I think that's what the anime is going for, trying to capture the mood of Narita's manga by reflecting an idealized America in the 80s through jazzy music video montages. It's less about capturing Narita's story and more about capturing her creative influences. This is especially seen in the soundtrack. Narita was a huge fan of Western pop music and made no secret about its influence on her manga. She went on the record by saying that Siva and Cypher's designs are based on her two biggest crushes in music, Tom Bailey of the Thompson Twins and Lamal from Kajagoogoo. I guess this explains why there's a Thompson Twins deep cut in the soundtrack. Someone dialed in a request. In fact, making the whole thing a series of music videos, interviews, and fake commercials also fits in capturing 80s Americana, because do you want to know what greatly influenced the overall 80s aesthetic as we know it today?
Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll.
It's hard to say the influence MTV had on 80s culture and pop culture in general. Plenty of people who are way smarter than me have written entire books on the subject. But MTV's impact in the 80s was, for a while, wholly American. Japan didn't even get MTV until the tail end of the decade, and even then it was just a block and not its own channel. And this is what Cipher the Video is ultimately going for. It is trying to capture Narita's tribute to 80s Americana by embodying the very face of 80s Americana, MTV. And in that regard, that's why Cipher the Video succeeds. It's all music videos, commercials, and interviews, the very essence of pop culture for the American teenager in the 80s. It's why they spend 20 minutes on a behind-the-scenes documentary narrated by Siva, or maybe Cipher, I don't know. It's MTV in OVA form. But while you may think I have solved this riddle, a few questions weigh on my mind still. We're not done yet. Not by a long shot. Because the Cipher the Video is a whole-scale tribute to 80s Americana, we need to see where it fits into the overall trend of romanticizing American culture in the 1980s. It's clear that there has been a trend in media of romanticizing 80s American culture. But how did this trend come to be? It was culturally the 80s up until 1991. That year saw the fall of the Soviet Union, the completion of Operation Desert Storm, and the release of Nirvana's Nevermind. The former two signaling that the 90s were now what political scientist Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. The brand of liberal democracy that America had championed since the end of World War II had emerged the triumphant ideology at the end of the Cold War and had proven itself very efficient in quickly resolving global conflicts. The latter signaling an overall cultural shift in the taste of Generation X, who had grown skeptical of the conspicuous consumption of the 1980s and desired something more. Thus, trends in aesthetics began to change. Everything from music to fashion to design was all about promoting a sense of authenticity. Because of those factors, the 80s was seen as a decade the culture wanted to get far away from. History had happened in that decade, and people were content in just seeing it fade away in the rearview mirror and look towards the brighter future that awaited them. Aside from movies like Grosse Pointe Blank and The Wedding Singer, 80s nostalgia in the 90s was rarely, if at all, catered to. The big nostalgia trend that decade had was 70s nostalgia, not just because it reflected Gen X's childhood, but also because it was perceived as the more authentic decade culturally. But by the early 2000s, things begin to change. America learns the hard way that history was still going on, and continues to do so to this day. With people realizing the future might not be as bright as they had once thought, people begin to take refuge into the past. With shows like VH1's I Love the 80s, people of the early 2000s began to re-explore the culture of the bygone era. But even if it was for nostalgia purposes, there was still a veneer of irony to it. It was less about longing for a simpler time, and more about enjoying the campiness associated with that era to provide some much-needed levity. But this began to evolve come the 2010s. Shows like Regular Show and games like Hotline Miami began to popularize 80s culture as a pleasing aesthetic, to say nothing of the popular synthwave and vaporwave movements of the same era. A couple years later, the 80s would soon evolve from just a popular aesthetic to a popular setting, with the advent of It, Stranger Things, and Glow. And with such frequency of mining 1980s America as a setting, this would eventually provoke discussion. Is 80s nostalgia being used to cover up what life was actually like in that decade? A bit unfair because those series do touch on the problems that were around in those days, but overall, you still get the feeling that the main motivation choosing this setting was a general agreement of, boy, weren't the 80s cool?
You know what I love most about this country? Capitalism.
Not helped by some cases actually using their 80s setting as a form of propaganda, rewriting a more Hollywood version of history where the American government were the heroes in any global conflicts they found themselves involved in. Now, I love 80s culture. Shocking, yes, but I wasn't around in the 80s. Most time I spent in that decade was as a pile of barely sentient cells inside my mother in the final months of 1989. But I've studied the 80s enough to know that, in America, it was actually a pretty crummy time period. Ronald Reagan and his administration are connected to a lot of the evil of that decade, from Iran-Contra to their deliberate inaction on the AIDS crisis, to heating up the Cold War in the name of American nationalism and putting the fear of nuclear annihilation onto the world populace. To say nothing of his economic policies, the damages of which are still being compounded to this day. And it's not like these things weren't reflected in the media of the 80s. Movies and music accurately reflected the overall sense of anxiety that people were feeling at the time. People who actually lived this decade knew it wasn't all sunshine and roses. So, if America really was that bad in the 80s, why does 80s nostalgia and romanticization still persist after all these years?
Soon television came along and gave us the gift of sight, but it was cable that gave us the freedom of choice.
Another thing that came about in the 80s was the rise of visual mass media. Channels like MTV, CNN, and Nickelodeon arose to bring content into people's homes 24/7, the movie industry began to start pumping out bigger films with more frequency with the rise of the blockbuster, and the popularization of the music video meant that artists could make a bigger impact with a unique style or sound. Nostalgia and romanticization of past decades has always been connected with the pop culture consumed in those time periods. But the 80s was the first decade where the people were more focused on the visual aspects of the media, which means we have a lot of visual history of what the culture was like back then. Because of this, the 80s has a lot more visual shorthand when compared to older decades, and therefore much easier to mythologize through visual media. By showcasing the culture through its visuals and media, 1980s America can become the fantastic world people want it to be. And do you know what one of the first pieces of media to do this successfully was? While Narita may have wanted to capture a version of 1980s America that was somewhat grounded in realism, it was still a sanitized, idealized version brought about by her overall fandom for Western media. Cipher the Video doubles down on that vision for America and turns the country into a romanticized music video set, having no idea, in 1989, that it would end up setting the tone for all other media romanticizing 1980s America. And this is not a knock against Cipher the Video. On the contrary, this is what makes the anime so fascinating to behold. So many other anime out there are locked into their time period with their aesthetics, but this one embraces the Americanized brand of aesthetics of that time period, the kind we Americans think about when we think the 80s. Do not mistake my critiques of romanticization of the 1980s Americana as love lost. I live for this shit. And if you are like me, you need to check out Cipher the Video, 80s anime's own perfect slice of an idealized West.
Yeah.